Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Streamer Time with Scott Biron. My name is Jim Schottenham. I'm the curator here at the American Museum of Fly Fishing. And as I just mentioned, I'm joined by, as always, by Scott. Scott is, of course, a HMH and Ewing Featherbirds Pro Staff member. He is our 2025 Volunteer of the Year. He's also an AMFF Ambassador. And I'm happy to call Scott my friend. Scott,
Yeah,
thanks for coming in again.
thanks for having me.
So today in this episode of Streamer Time, we're going to be talking about a really interesting fly with a creator that has an equally interesting story. So we're going to be talking about the Chief Needahbeh fly. And Scott, I think the first place to start when talking about this is there's a number of different ways that I've heard his name pronounced. What's the proper way to say his
Why
name?
don't we start with Roland Nelson?
That would be
Because
his.
that was his real name,
Okay.
Roland Eugene Nelson. And he went by this, his more or less stage name was Chief Needahbeh. And he was interesting character. He was part of the Penobscot Nation, which was the Abenaki tribe, I think. And he was more or less a expert on the tribe. And he was a librarian. He kept a lot of the information. And he went around and lectured at colleges and presentations and whatnot. Um, you know, and that's he went under the name of Chief Needahbeh. That was his.
So how did he get involved and how did he come to have a fly by his name? And
Well, I at some point he had a fly shop. He liked to fish. It was based up in Greenville, Maine, up on the east end of the Moosehead Lake.
okay,
And somehow he got connected with the sportsman shows in uh, New England. Boston used to have a big one, and he coordinated himself with the producer of the show to see if he could become the MC, for a lack of a better term, and to keep those shows were much different. They had a lot of presentations going
sure.
on, people running around doing all sorts of different things. Unlike a lot of the shows today, the presentation was the main thing that was going on a big stage, and so he was up there in full headgear and Indian clothing, Native American clothing, and obviously attracted some attention. But when they were doing the Ted Williams or Herb Wells, Jesse Scott doing the casting demonstrations in the distance casting, he was the guy that was, he was the Johnny Carson.
Okay, so he's
Yeah,
interviewing all these people
yeah,
at
yeah,
the show, talking to them
yeah,
about
yeah,
what they're
yeah,
doing.
yeah, right.
Okay.
And I think he at the Boston show, some 20 years he did it. So.
And
uh,
what era was he?
it would have been
50s?
50s,
Okay.
probably, whenever the late 40s, early 50s in that time frame. And he didn't live past 54, so it had to be sometime, before that. And he had a fly that, we can start with. He was up off of Wilson Camps up in on Moosehead, and there was a dam somewhere up there. And he, in a letter that we have a copy of, that was a letter that he wrote Colonel Bates when he was writing the book on streamers and bucktails. He said there were a bunch of anglers out in front. They were fly fishing with the standard patterns: black ghost, gray ghost, red and white bucktail, and they weren't catching anything. And he said they needed, he felt that they needed something that wasn't seen all the time by the
Okay.
fish. So he creates this fly, and we can show a picture of
Yeah,
it.
do you want to start out by
Yeah.
by showing an example?
Yeah. So here's an example of it. This is actually one that he tied. And to be frank with you, in his letters, he said he had Bert Quimby tying the flies for him. And this is probably, in my opinion, the only one that's out there that he actually tied, that's left.
Okay, and that fly is part of the Bates collection.
Correct.
When Bates was putting his books together, he
Correct.
asked for examples from all the tires that were featured in his book.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that the chief, as he was referred to, sent Bates wanted to put this fly in. He reached out to the chief, asked him for a recipe, some details on this fly and others that he might want to include, and a copy of one. And so the recipe that was returned by the chief to Bates is slightly different than that photograph that we have. This one has a tag on it. This one has a collar that's red. And in the notes, there's no reference to a tag. There's reference to a collar that is yellow with red on top of it, which is not unusual because fly tires, I think what Bates's greatest achievement was to take all these different tires and the way they wrote their recipes, because they weren't all standard, and to standardize them.
Okay.
And I think that's why he wanted an actual copy of the fly so he could make sure that what he was writing was accurate.
Okay, so he's matching up the example that was sent to him with the recipe that the chief sent him, making sure that everything matched up. And in this case, it probably didn't match up, so Colonel Bates had to kind of
he refined it a little
Yeah.
bit. Yeah, and you know, the other part is that throats, collars, they all got wound in together, wings, and people interpretation of bodies and different things. They were all different. And so it's a challenge. And I mean, I took the picture of that fly. Here's the chief's actual handwriting on his fly, the Chief Needahbeh, and you can see it talks about a body red floss ribbed with silver tinsel, and in Bates's book he talks about narrow silver tinsel because obviously he's got other patterns of different tires in there with medium tinsel and when you look at that, it's narrow tinsel.
Sure,
so
he can
really did a great job. Really did a great job taking it down and putting it together. So,
and in fact, some of the letter, and I think you and I had talked about this before. So there's that little note that's attached to the letter, and I'm of the assumption that that's a note for Bates. He wanted to produce this in a book, but he didn't want to put it in at 100%. So that 68%, that note is simply he's going to reduce it to that size
right,
for inclusion in the book.
right.
But this is a letter from the chief to
Right,
Colonel Bates.
right, and they had a couple letters back and forth because in the original letter from the chief to Bates, he put in something about there was a New Jersey angler that he knew that was catching all these fish, and then I guess subsequent to when the letter was written, he found out that that wasn't true, and so he wanted to correct it, you know, to make sure it was correct in the book.
Well, that had to be awfully difficult for Colonel Bates to keep track of all these notes and changes. I mean, you think about it, this is one fly. He sent an example. It doesn't match up with the recipe, so he's got to tweak that a little. Now the conversation's going back and forth and multiply that by how many flies are in the book.
Well, and we've been lucky because we've been down there. Pam Bates has had us down there a number of times to look through stuff and help her with some things in there. And we've looked at some of the typewriter must have been going 24/7.
There's a lot of documentation. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let's talk about this fly. It was the hook that was used was a Limerick size 6, maybe a 6X, 7X, 8X in that range. Remember, we've talked about this before. Each manufacturer had their own kind of version and size. And today there's no standardization in hooks. It was a Limerick bend, which this is. It's got that nice bend off it. And I'm tying this a little bit bigger than I would for one that I would fish with, simply because I think I would take this down one more size, like from a 2 or to a 4 or a 6, just because it works better that way. Also, if you remember back to the picture we just showed, the wing on this is quite long, almost 1.5 times the length of the body. And that would have been consistent with how everyone tied their flies back then. You know, Carrie Stevens had the hooks weren't
Yeah,
that long.
right.
She had long, but we remember from our due diligence with
The Letourneau
the
brothers.
Letourneau brothers that they were that's where the flies became tandems. But we're going to shorten the wing a little bit. So what I'm going to do is make it look like it would fish today with a single hook.
Okay.
So
And now there was also something you had mentioned earlier before we started the webinar here. There were other people tying these for the chief, which is why you believe that the only real chief tied example is probably in the Bates collection.
yeah, I mean, he could have tied other ones that people bought, but in that Bates collection, Bates has typed that note that we show that says this was received and tied by
Okay.
right. So if Bert Quimby, who was a jobber up in the area where Needahbeh had his shop, if he would have been tying and he altered the fly, he took out the tail. And people say he took out the collar to a certain extent. So he didn't the tail. You'll see, and I'll talk about when we put in the tail. But the tail is duck or goose quill, and because of that, it's very, very susceptible to get just beat up completely by catching one or two fish. But the chief, in his note to Bates, said that tail was important in his mind, that it was like a flag, and it fished better with the tail, whether it got chewed up or not.
Okay.
So I'm going to use red thread as a base here. And if you've seen me do this before, if you're watching this, you know I always use white. But because his body is red, makes it real simple to use this red underneath it. It just when the floss gets wet, it won't darken. It'll stay that color red.
And this would be a really good time for me to interject. So Scott has not only been kind enough to teach us how to tie a number of these flies, but Scott has also participated in a Tackle Talk episode where he shared a lot of tips and tactics about his fly tying. So some of the things that you're watching Scott do at the Vice here, if you're not familiar, if you're a relative freshman when it comes to tying, I recommend that you go out to amff.org, look up the webinar series Tackle Talk, and find the episode where Scott and I were talking about some of his tips and tactics, because it'll certainly help you with your tying. So sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Keep talking. I had somebody actually call me the other day and say that they wanted they had tied for a long time, but they wanted a refresher lesson because they were afraid they were kind of getting away from the basics. And I said, what you should do is go to the museum's website and watch that episode because it had a lot of tips in it. So we're going to put the silver tag. And with a limerick bend hook, one of the cool things you can do is just run this thing back. So you're actually into the bend. With a tag, we want that tag to be first wrap on bare hook. And then I'm going to give this three turns and then kind of tie it
Is
up.
there a specific reason to put that first wrap or two on the bare hook as
Gives
opposed
you a
to?
little taper.
Okay.
Makes it a little bit kind of a little bit more secure, I think, when you put it on. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to put on is the tail, and then we'll build the body. So the tail is red quill, and you can get, when you buy these, you get pairs, and these aren't really pairs. These are just little pieces that I have. But because this fly doesn't really need to have matched wings because the tail's so short, I can just kind of finesse it a little bit.
And this is what the chief deemed to be very important on his fly.
Right. And actually, I'll show you a little trick. So you could take one piece of quill, right, like that, and just fold it in half for a tail like this.
Move that up just a little bit. The vise was kind of There you go. There you go.
and just fold it in half, and then you got a nice little tail right
Oh,
there.
look at that.
Okay. And the quill, when you put it on, you want to just get it right in place, just like that. Couple turns, and you should be pretty good. And then what I do is I kind of reach up, see if I can do this, a little gymnastics here. Reach it up, and then I kind of cut it off at a slight angle. Okay. So there we go with that. Now I'm gonna put on the rib. And a lot of people ask me, well, why didn't you just do it, the tag and the rib all at once? Well, you can, but then you have to work your rib around the tail. Sometimes it doesn't always work real well. Um, then I'm going to put the floss. So I have red floss, and this is single strand, and I'm going to get it. I want 2 strands of it. So I'll just even them up. Put the second strand.
You figure you've got about 18 inches of material there, I think.
Way more than I need,
More, okay.
but I'd rather have a little bit more to show on the demonstration than less. And then I'm going to work up. Let's get the first couple together. And then I'm going to work up to about 1/3 of the body up the shank away from the point of the hook. Because what he did here was he put a little hackle collar in there, little like throat in the back. Now you could use regular saddle. Today, if you used a dry fly saddle, what you would find is that the stem would be really stiff, really difficult to put in place. What I do is I just take a piece of hen and take about a 1/2 inch of the hen, kind of pull it off. So what I got is a little
There's
tiny piece.
that is
like
tiny, yeah.
Okay. And then I just take a snip here, lay it directly on the bottom, and then tie it in. And in Bates's book, in his recipe, he says you could palmer hackle along and get the same effect. And if you look in the Herb Welsh book that the Hilliards wrote, Leslie Hilliard has tied a great looking Chief Needahbeh with a silver body and a red hackle palmered. So it gives you that effect. Now what I got to do is I'm going to go up, and this is where it gets to be a little bit of work. And I'm going to just, for the first couple turns, I'm going to pull that hackle out of the way each time I go around. And this is probably why Bert Quimby took this out, because you don't make any money tying it this way. But as far as I can fathom, this was the way that the chief intended the little throat to look. And I think he probably took a page out of some Atlantic salmon flies that were tied with multiple throats up the body.
Okay.
But often those are tied, and every time there's a transition between the throat and the body material, the body material changed colors, so they were able to get away with a little of the. Okay, so now I'm up, and I can just it's now in place. So now I can just kind of pick up speed here. And then just take this up. This becomes a nice little body. And as much as he was concerned about the tail getting beat up with fish, we know that one thing that happened a lot of times with floss bodies and silk bodies is once a brook trout or a salmon's teeth hit it, it was frayed. And oftentimes the ones that were the most beat up were actually the ones that caught the most fish. So I think fish are opportunistic, and if they see something that's injured, well, maybe it's easier for them to jump on it.
Sure.
And then we're gonna just put some ribs on.
And this was also employed as a bass fly, wasn't it?
Well, yes, and I think the cool part about the bash fly is when we do our wing, we're gonna have two yellow on each side and a red on the outside.
Mhm.
And the bass version was two yellow with an orange on the outside. And it's not only it's a it should be marketed as a great warm water fish because you can imagine a pickerel hammering that.
Oh, of course.
Okay, or
Yeah.
so there's your body. Everything's pretty cool with your body like that. And what I'm going to do is just put a whip finish in there just because I'm talking and I don't want this thing come undone because I'll start crying and we'll need a grief counselor, so we don't want that. All right, so now we're going to build the wing. And the wing, like I said, is two red. So we take this nice red Ewing saddle, and we're going to get two. And we're going to get two that are probably nice one there. So we want them to look like about this.
Good.
Good looking one. And I'll take one from the other side that kind
Pardon
of
me.
matches up with it. It's probably all that wildfire smoke we're dealing with here today.
Yeah, so Scott was mentioning earlier, we never really know exactly what the light conditions are going to be in the last couple of days here in southern Vermont. And I know elsewhere, there's been quite a lot of smoke, a lot of haze.
Yeah. Yeah, it almost looks like an eclipse at sometimes. Okay, and then we're going to go with the yellow. So what we want is two yellow. We get two yellow here per side. And these Ewing ones are really nice because they have a nice stem for streamers and their colors are really vibrant. And for this fly, this is a for lack of it's like a daredevil, you know?
Okay, sure.
It's got some wacky colors in it that don't necessarily um, you know, relate to a bait fish, okay, like most streamers have. Now on bait on Needahbeh's pattern, his wing would have looked more like this. See how long it
Yeah,
is?
extends quite a
Right.
bit past the.
And we're not gonna do that because we want to catch a fish. So, and I think that was something that over time the the saddles that they were using back then were not off. They were a lot of them were uh, rolls of feathers that were sewed together, and it was a little difficult to get a couple that really were the same shape and everything, and so they just ended up with some that were to get the coloring right. They had to be a little longer, but we can we can we can make this a little bit more modernized and still get the same look with pretty much exactly what his recipe was. Well, that went down. We'll find that in a minute. I have to get it. I'll have to go down there and get it. I can see it. That's
So I can certainly see why that color would be popular, especially for smallmouth. I think that
right. right, the orange, and they would, he had jungle cock on it, and most of the main flies kind of had that jungle cock on them. And this fly he had, really set up for salmon and brook trout. But also he said that there were people who were fishing this in Florida for in saltwater. The only thing I would say about that is the hook would have to be saltwater hook. So you'd be stainless steel, or you'd have a hook that had, you know, by the end of the day, it'd be completely rusted.
Yeah, you'd go through a lot of flies.
Right. So, and you know, I'm talking and doing this, but when you do these, you move right along when you're not yakking about a million things. So, but the cool part about this whole uh, business is with this particular fly, and with the Bates book, and with information that the Hilliards got, is that these flies changed. These guys that were tying were enhancing them all the time. And maybe the first version wasn't ever one that was ever written about. I know that I've given flies to friends of mine that I've developed and said, fish these, let me know how they work out. And, they would say, give me input, and then that might, uh, I might change them, alter them a little bit.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
know a guy who'll take a fly, a standard fly, and tie it. He's a guide, and he will eliminate one aspect of the fly every time, and until the fly becomes non-effective. And as a guide, he just wants to get flies tied quickly for his customers. And so if he knows that by removing a couple pieces, he can tie it faster, it works for him.
Oh,
Okay, let
sure.
me get this baby that fell down. Okay, now what I'm going to do with these, and you see me do it before, I just like to, even though they probably didn't do it this way, I always think that this makes the fly a little bit more um, strong. So this is the fabric fusion that I use, and I just put a little bit on the stem and along the stem into the first like 16th of an inch of feather, and I sandwich them together. And basically, that's what it
Yep,
looks
yep,
like.
that's what it looks
Okay.
like.
So you can see, I gotta twitch my hands around here,
There
right
we
like
go.
that.
Right.
Okay. And as I'm talking, and dropped it again, as I'm talking, um, it'll dry in no time. And then I'll do the other side as well.
So as you just mentioned, it's just a question of reversing the colors to make it more effective for warm water fish.
Right. So he just kept, he took the red out and put an orange in. And, you're going to have orange and, and yellow, and kept the red collar. Might have changed the red collar at one time to make it a collar that would be orange. A
Mhm.
lot of things you could do to it. So while those are drying, the next thing is to get two jungle cop. Once we put that wing on, we're going to just take two short ones, because they're going to actually kind of be hidden to a certain extent. So a lot of people ask me about, where do you get this? And the ones I get are all split. These are the ones the split doesn't matter,
Okay.
because you're gonna see in a minute, once I get this whole thing together, that the split, it's going to be hidden. So I'm going to wax my thread just a little bit. I want to, you're kind of melting the wax on there. And when I mount my wing, what I want to do is the wax is going to melt onto the stem at the tie-in point. And when it does that, it's going to hold it nice in place. That's nice right there. Okay. You can
Nice.
see that's a good looking fly right there. Then what he would do is he would take his jungle cock, just pull off some of the fluff. And one of the things with the jungle cock is when you're pulling the fluff off, a lot of times you break the stem, so you have to be careful. They just get brittle after a while. So when you do the little ones, it's not like you're going to remove a lot. You just take your time and take a few pieces off, and then you get it. And then what I like to do is, because this stuff is really not that strong, I take a little bit of that fabric fusion. I just put a little bit of that on the back. I'm going to lay this in place. See how that's right in there?
Sure.
Nice and glued on. So that it kind of gives it a little bit more strength. And if you look at the jungle cock, there's a white area, and I kind of try to grab that area because that is it's pretty strong there.
How long does that normally take to dry when you're gonna? It's probably dry already.
It's I would say in the next minute it's completely dry and it's waterproof. That's the cool part about this, right? Because a lot of these things are not waterproof. So now I'm just going to take this and trim in the opposite order. I'm going to take the jungle cock off, and I'll explain why in a second. Then I'm going to trim. This is going to happen in like 2 cuts. So I got it. Now what I want to do is I want to start right behind the eye, and I want to build a ramp. That ramp's going to come up, and I want that ramp to be pretty tapered. Because the last part of this fly is a collar that's kind of heavy. And I'm going to take a piece of hen. And again, you could use a dry fly hackle that was dyed red, but I think you would find that the stem would be thicker than you would want it, and it would be a little less motion in the water. When he was tying his flies, Quimby was tying their flies, the genetics in the hackles were not as they are today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make this little, see how I stroke the feathers back a little bit and made a mini triangle up at the
Yeah.
top. I'm going to trim it so it's pretty small now. Let's see if you can see that. Hold on, let me move it. Yeah, you can see it better right there now. Now you can see it right there on the skin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this up on the side of that ramp that I just built and grab it and just wind it in. Now, I'll say that don't be surprised if this breaks when I wind it, because it sometimes the first inch or two of the stem is kind of brittle.
Okay.
But sometimes you get away with it. And if you look, what I did was I kind of stroke the feather through my fingers. I don't pull my fingers. I let the feather stroke through, and then I just take a wrap around. Once. And then once you get that first one on, you're going to get some of the fibers are going to stick out the wrong way. But with this hen, it's in the end, we're going to be able to trim off any wayward pieces. And we're also going to be able to kind of direct it back. And I'll show you how. So that's pretty thick right there. kind of overdressed was what the kernel. And if you look at the fly, we can look at it again, and you can see it's really kind of overdressed. So I've trimmed it off, and you can see there's some spiky going
Sure.
every which way.
Sure.
But with hen, if you pinch it, and then get it in place, get rid of this red thread, because it's a blackhead. And we'll just go over it and make a blackhead. And with you heard me do this before, you want to start in the front, behind the eye, and work yourself back. Once you get there, you can trim off this. And if you look at the original, the head was pretty big, to be honest with you. So I'm just gonna try to taper that head so it's like a bullet shape. And then I'm gonna do a whip finish. And there is your Chief Needahbeh.
Very
Now,
nice. Yeah.
it's got some, you can see it's got some bait fish look to it. You can see that the jungle cock is going to be um, kind of masked by a little bit by the wing here, the hen. Once that's in the water, you give it a pull, it's going to taper down. When you stop your pull, it's going to pulse out. It's going to look like it's breathing, like it's alive. So it's got, I think it's a kind of a cool pattern to get you to use as an attractor. It doesn't really look like anything. I'm gonna put some head cement on this, get it nice and strong.
So it doesn't look like anything that they're used to seeing in the water, in other words.
No, it's like I said, it's like a daredevil. It's got a unique kind of coloring to it. But you can see, I mean, so the chief, one of the things that he was experimenting with was he was getting into the area of bi-wing flies. He supposedly he in one of his notes to Colonel, there were several notes that went back and forth. In what he had to Colonel Bates, he had said that he was in his car or truck or something, and he saw some bugs on the windshield. And when he looked, he was looking at him from the fish's aspect. He was looking at him from the bottom, like, and he saw that they were a little bit wider. They were not as tapered as a streamer. And he fancied himself as somebody who was directly involved with promoting streamer fishing.
Really?
So he felt he used to fish in Sebago, and when he was young, he fished and he trolled and he fished with flies, but he used streamers. So, everybody has a niche. He was trying to set himself up that way. But what he did say was that the profile of the flies that he was looking at from underneath were wider than this pattern, or the, black ghost, gray
Sure.
ghost, right? And even the red and white bucktail being thicker material, it still had a different profile. So he was experimenting with putting a white wing of bucktail on top, and then putting the two pieces of red bucktail, the two bunches of red bucktail, on like at maybe 2 and 11 o'clock.
Okay.
So it was like a flat wing that he was tying. He took Quimby's Green Ghost and changed it into a flat, made suggestions to change it into a flat wing. And he had one of the patterns that was, I think maybe we've mentioned this before in previous episode, but he called it a salmon fly that he had developed. And it had a silver body, and it was gray squirrel tail. Gray squirrel is probably the most underrated material around. It was used a ton back in the 50s.
Why do you think it fell out of fashion?
It's just not the lights bells, you
No.
know. But it's you look at a lot of the Atlantic salmon flies from Canada have, hairwing
Mhm.
flies. They have material like that in it. Um, this fly's been saltwater, freshwater. We were looking at the freshwater. They've turned it into a spay fly, beautiful spay fly pattern for the Northwest. So it's one of those patterns that, multi-use.
Mhm.
We've had a lot of those. Casaboom,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Breeder fly, right? Gray Ghost kind of kicked off the whole streamer aspect,
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot of history. The I've said this before, all fly tyers are characters. This guy was definitely a character. Just by, people that I knew. I had a friend who's passed away that said he had known him. And his family knew him. He was a really nice guy, unique, but he was a character.
Mm.
So
And he passed relatively young too.
yeah, right. You can imagine um that could have had something that didn't let him live a full life, but people didn't live as long as they do now. So
Right.
yeah.
It sounds like he enjoyed himself traveling to a lot of these shows, and I mean, he was palling around with people like Ted Williams, and
Yeah, I mean, I've got a great photograph of him, on stage in his full gear, headdress, everything, and there he's up there, and Ted Williams is a relatively young Ted Williams is up there with him casting, and we know from some of the history here at the museum, there's a lot of history
Mhm.
with Williams and Wolf, and Williams with other, anglers, and that was he played baseball to make money and he fished because that's what he loved to do and tie
Yeah,
flies. So, yeah.
yeah. So I'm sure he loved going to those shows. Then, and it's interesting too that you mentioned some of the elaborate setups that you used to find when you went to the sports shows in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. I'm reminded of some of the really intricate buildings that they would put together, going back to Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby at some of the New York shows. They would have these main cabins reproduced on the show floors with full fish mounts and game mounts.
And he was involved in that. I think if I'm remembering correctly, he asked, and this might have been his entry into becoming involved with those. He wanted to bring a full Indian village to one of the shows in New York, and he did. And that, then he basically said to the promoter, you want this to be better, you got to have me as your MC. God, and he wasn't shy about promoting himself, his flies. He's very honest with his letters back and forth with Joe Bates. And when we sit here and we talk about one fly, but we see how these all dovetail together and how there can be confusion, different patterns, different
Mhm.
references to patterns. And then you had Bates writing his book with no, you can't just Google Chief Needahbeh fly,
Right,
right?
sure.
He had to go to the actual source and, get the information and sort through it and put it together. And, there are a lot of flies in his book that just are mentioned, but this had the recipe with a little bit of, underlying story with it. And, you know, stood the test of time. I was running around you getting me the book. I didn't bring it today. I wanted to just make sure, because we're going to put an article together for the
Oh,
journal,
great.
and it'll be a little more in depth and whatnot, and have a little bit more on the differences, nuances, and stuff. But just want to make sure because every time you look at something that's slightly different, and as we know, somebody may have more information that can add to this at some point. And
Sure.
yeah,
Well, given that he had a shop up in Maine, it's very likely that he probably spent at least a little bit of time. Maybe if you didn't have a lot of customers in the shop at the time, you may have spent some time behind the device.
right, right,
So there
right.
could be other examples that were authenticated or could be authenticated as tied by him. But up to this point, we really don't know of many others
No.
aside from what's in the Bates collection currently.
Right. And
Um,
thank goodness that the Hilliards have the letter he wrote to Shaw's, or were able to get it, to see it. And we were able to see what he wrote to Colonel Bates, because some of those letters that were written, you can barely read them. At least the penmanship was pretty good. And it was addressed from Bates to Chief Needahbeh, Greenville, Maine. And it got to him. So he was known
I
up
guess he
there.
was, yeah, no, didn't have to worry about house
Yeah.
numbers or anything else. So, and this all goes to the museum's mission, of course, of preserving the history and documenting these things. And I'm willing to bet when you do your article, you'll provide the recipe
Yep.
in
Oh,
addition to
definitely.
what we have here. So
Yep.
it'll be a very nice compliment to read the article. And
Right.
if you want to sit behind the device
Bang one out.
yeah, try
Yeah.
one yourself.
It's not, the materials aren't very expensive. I'm sure you could get away with not having the jungle clock eyes. But this pattern, the era of this pattern, jungle clock was readily available. It was inexpensive, and it was odd to see streamers without the jungle
Sure.
clock eye.
Well, if I've learned anything from these webinars that you provide for us, Scott, it's typically these tires may have done something a little bit different from others, but there was always a reason behind it. So you mentioned that this is going to slim down when it's pulled through, expand at rest, those types of things. The tail, the chief thought that was important. Subsequent tires Quimby may not have thought there's not enough money in it for me to spend my time doing that. But all of these, whether the jungle cock is hidden behind anything else, there's always a reason for it.
Right.
So there must have been some trial and error, some experimentation.
Exactly. You can imagine that he probably fished with a bunch of them and might have said to Quimby, hey, let's do this or let's do that. But at the same time, Quimby was selling them, and he was, like kind of like Wendell Falkins after he bought Carrie Stevens' business, no one can make money tying the flies the way she was.
Yeah.
And he was very outspoken with that, so he kind of altered a little bit, and you got to make it work for you. So
And Wendell being the only person that Carrie took the time to show how she did
Right.
those things. That was something she kept very close to herself.
Right. And I think today fly shops, the flies that are being sold, the shops are working very hard to keep the price down. So there's no sticker shock, because these things don't last forever, and most of them end up in the tree. And so a lot of tires who tie commercially are struggling right now because they can't cover the material, because the material has cost so much. The hooks are very expensive now. And they're really questioning, is this worth it? It's like we've got to this point, and the material is way more advanced than it was before, but it costs money to advance it. And yet the fly shops feel that they have to keep the flies at a competitive rate, so that the people won't just buy two, they'll buy 22, and 20 will end up in the tree.
You see me cast. Huh?
Oh, yeah.
So it should be brought to everyone's attention too that some of the products that Scott uses to put these flies together, the fabric bond and all of that, those things weren't available to a lot of these tires back in the day.
Right,
so
right.
I'm sure that they spent a fair amount of time really sitting behind the device. I mean, the Deddies, the Darbys, and the Quimbys, they spent a lot of time at their craft.
Yeah, it wasn't. And the fact that they could reproduce the flies right, almost identical back to back.
Yeah.
The hen hackle, the chicken hackle back then was, the rooster stuff. It was not consistent.
Yeah.
One goes to another. So.
Well, once again, Scott, you've educated us on an important fly and another person in fly tying history. We thank you for that, folks. If you enjoyed this particular webinar, I encourage you to go out and check out some of the others that Scott's done. You can find that from amff.org. You can look at our webinar and film page. We have Real Talk, Tackle Talk, and then of course Streamer Tying with Scott Biron. So if you're not a member, I certainly encourage you to join. You can also do that at the website, amff.org. I encourage you to do that because your memberships help support programs like this, where we can educate people. And And of course, a little selfishly, I get to spend more time learning how to tie flies with Scott. So,
Yeah.
so Scott, once again, thank you for
Thank you.
coming in. I
Thanks for having
appreciate it. Enjoy, everyone. Thank you.